In this video, we will talk about Judaism as a living tradition. When we talk about Judaism, we're often talking about a collection of different sects or branches of this religious tradition. We've talked in previous videos about the origins of the tradition, as well as the scriptures. These are, for the most part, the same across the different branches of Judaism. However, there are some different denominations or sects that have different ideas on how they observe their religious tradition. The first of these is Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism is perhaps as close to ancient Judaism as you can find in the modern world. Orthodox Judaism is focused on preserving Jewish tradition. There are, like anything, degrees to which people observe the Jewish tradition. Some Orthodox Jews, for example, when we talk about food laws, will not eat unclean or non-kosher food. This can go as far as having different utensils and cookware for preparing things like dairy versus meat, since they're not supposed to be cooked together. Or if the person is even more orthodox, this could go as far as having separate kitchens for that. We see a branch of Orthodox Judaism called Hasidism. Hasidism can go into Jewish mysticism a bit as well, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But Hasidism is often an Orthodox community that has separated itself from modern society. In the video that you'll be watching for this module, you will watch a video of a Hasidic Jewish community in New York City. Hasidic Jews will take certain passages of the Hebrew Bible very seriously, such as things like not shaving the side of one's head. So you'll see the distinctive ringlets for men who are Hasidic Jews. You might see this for Orthodox Jews as well, but it's particularly noticeable in Hasidic Judaism. While Orthodox Judaism is focused on preserving Jewish tradition, Reform Judaism, which developed around the 18th century in Europe, is focused on assimilating into culture. When Reform Judaism began around the 18th century, it was very much a deist branch of Judaism. This means that the focus was simply on worshiping Yahweh, the God of Judaism, and not so much following the laws or the mitzvot, commandments that we see that Orthodox Jews will focus on. For Reform Jews, this is often a cultural religion. There are even some Reformed Jews who really don't have a belief in a deity. They can be agnostic and still be Reformed Jews. Now, after Reformed Judaism began around the 18th century, about a century later, in the 19th century in Europe, we see conservative Judaism form. While Orthodox Judaism is focused on preserving Jewish tradition, and Reform Judaism is focused on assimilating into culture, conservative Judaism essentially takes the middle path there. Conservative Judaism recognizes that Jewish tradition is essential to Jewish identity and should be preserved, but it also recognizes that it's impossible to follow all of the Jewish law that their ancestors did in the modern world. Conservative Judaism ends up taking essentially aspects from both Orthodox and Reform Judaism, understanding how things like food laws, Sabbath observance, and so on function in the modern world, keeping them as much as possible, but also recognizing that rules have to be changed and they have to adapt to modern civilization. These are the three main branches of Judaism that we see in the 21st century. However, there's also a fourth branch of Judaism, which is popular in some areas. This is called Kabbalah, which is often referred to as a Jewish mysticism. Kabbalah is focused on God as Ein Sof. Ein Sof literally means endless light or endless being. Kabbalah Judaism teaches that Yahweh is Ein Sof and that Ein Sof emanates into humanity through different spiritual principles or emanations, which are called Sephirot. And we see these in the Tree of Life, which is depicted here on the right. The idea is that God emanates or projects themselves into everyday life and into people in certain ways, and that people have these spiritual principles within them, things to follow. For example, on the top left you see Binah, which means understanding. Or in the middle on the right, Chesed, which means loving kindness. These principles are important ways to connect to Ein Sof and ways that Ein Sof emanates into the world. Like with any religious tradition, the primary way that we see Judaism in the 21st century is through Jewish rituals. One of the most important is prayer. There is this idea in Jewish prayer of kavanah, which literally means intention. There are certain prayers that many Jews will follow, whether it's prayers before meals, prayers before wine, reciting passages of Torah, and so on. But the idea of kavanah or intention is that the mind and heart should be focused in the same place and focused on Yahweh in order to fully be praying in the best way. Men will often have certain clothing items that they will wear for prayer as well as everyday life. During prayer, we see talith worn by men, and these are fringed shawls, as you can see on the right-hand side. We often will see kippah or yarmulke, which is the cap that goes around the back of the skull, often called a skull cap. And we see tefillin, and tefillins are the boxes that this man is wearing on his forehead that contain passages from the Torah. We get this commandment in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, which is referred to as the Shema. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children, and talk about them when you are at home, when you are away, when you lie down, and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." We see some men, especially Orthodox Jewish men, will wear tefillin, and this is following the commandment in the Shema literally, binding parts of the Torah on their foreheads. These are markers of Jewish identity, as well as ways to essentially establish sacred space when praying. And we see these rituals often come up in synagogue worship. Synagogues, remember, or Bet Knesset, are houses of gathering. And these houses of gathering are places that Jews will gather together to worship Yahweh. There will typically be reading from the Torah. In Orthodox Jewish communities, the synagogues might be split between men and women for purity. In Reform synagogues, you might not see a split, and it might not be as formal. And this is simply dependent on the branch of Judaism and the particular community. Perhaps the most famous Jewish identity marker or ritual that we see in modern Judaism is dietary laws. When we talk about Jewish dietary laws, we talk about kashrut, which is the general encompassing food law or food law code for Judaism. Kashrut has particular rules like not eating unclean animals, which are animals like pigs, even shellfish, not eating meat with dairy, because in Exodus it says not to boil a child in its mother's milk, and many other dietary laws. And these all fall under the umbrella of kashrut. Kosher is not the food law, but rather is a label on a food. So if you notice on particular foods that you find at the grocery store, you might pick it up and it has a label saying the food is kosher. This means that this food has the label of kosher, clean, and fits under the general dietary law of kashrut. To be kosher, foods have to follow kashrut, and depending on the branch of Judaism or the emphasis of the person, for a food to be kosher, they often have to be blessed by a rabbi. Finally, we see Jewish identity and religion in the modern world through Jewish holidays. Not as much a holiday, but a weekly observance. We see Shabbat, also called Sabbath. This occurs from sundown on Friday until sundown on Saturday, and is understood as a day of rest, based on the idea that Yahweh took a day to rest after creation. Shabbat, again depending on the branch of Judaism, will be observed sometimes very strictly, with not being able to perform any work, sometimes even not turning on light switches or cooking, while other Jews might simply take time out of it for meditation or prayer. One important holiday that we see is Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, or literally head of the year. And on Rosh Hashanah, Jews will often celebrate by eating apples and honey as an idea of bringing hope and goodness into the new year. Pesach, or Passover, is a celebration of the Exodus from Egypt. Before the Exodus, there, according to the book of Exodus, were 10 plagues, and the last plague was the slaughter of firstborns. During the slaughter, anyone who put lamb's blood on their door would be passed over. So Passover, or Pesach, is a special holiday for the Jews as a commemoration of the idea that Yahweh passed over the people who followed his commandments. During Passover, there's a special meal called a Seder, and has certain foods that are symbolic and special for that occasion. Another important Jewish holiday is Hanukkah. This is the Festival of Lights. Hanukkah literally means to dedicate, and it commemorates the purification and rededication of the temple in Jerusalem after the Greeks had invaded and desecrated the temple. According to some traditions, the Jews had to burn the menorah and keep it burning for rededication and purification purposes, but there was only enough oil for one night. It took 8 days for a rabbi to bless and purify oil to be used in the menorah. And the oil that they had miraculously lasted the 8 nights before new oil could be blessed. So this is why you will see a menorah with 8 candlesticks during Hanukkah. Sukkot is a harvest festival, often called the Festival of Tabernacles or Festival of Booths. This commemorates the 40 years that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, which we see in the book of Exodus. During Sukkot, there are sukkah, or tabernacles, booth, and these are somewhat like harvest houses that are small, and people would sleep out here to commemorate this festival and harvest grains and other crops. And finally, we have Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and this is a day on which ancient Israelites would sacrifice in the temple, but afterward it would be a day of reflection and atoning for one's sins. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to describe the 4 main branches of Judaism and distinguish among them, identify and describe important rituals in modern Judaism, explain Jewish dietary laws and their importance, and identify and describe various Jewish holidays that are celebrated in the 21st century.